Sure, we've all thought about it. What if I was the GM of my favorite hockey team? On today's edition of Locked On NHL, what I would have done if I was running the Oilers in the summer of 2024.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. This upcoming NHL season will be my fourth as a host on the Locked On Podcast Network, and I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, team every day, Monday to Friday. And on today's show, which, by the way, is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. On today's show, we're going to walk through a very fun thought exercise. And yes, we have the benefit of hindsight. We know what's happened in the subsequent 14 months, and there's a lot to digest. And these are the sports world hypotheticals that keep you up at night, the sliding doors moments. And I love using that sliding doors metaphor because when you pull a sliding door, yes, it's opening one of the two halves of said sliding door, but that other side is closing. And in the sports world, it might not necessarily be a binary one or the other, but when you make one decision as far as personnel, whether that's a coach, a player, how much money you pay them, whatever, when you make one decision, that is going to have a trickle-down effect, a subsequent effect on everything else you do, because everything, when it comes to roster construction, is interconnected. So we're going to start with just walking through the options the Oilers had last summer. Who was an unrestricted free agent? Who was a restricted free agent? Who was approaching one of those two? So someone who would be this summer. And then in our second segment, we're going to pivot to what I personally would have done. And then in our final segment, I'll speculate on how much things would have changed based on those personnel differences. So to start things out, if you'll recall, summer 2024, Oilers make the Stanley Cup final for the first time since that 2005-06 season coming out of the lockout. They are a team that feels like it has firmly cemented itself amongst the league's bona fide Stanley Cup contenders. McDavid wins the Conn Smythe for 41 points in 25 playoff games in a losing effort in the Stanley Cup final, first time that had happened in more than 20 years. You are talking about a team that auditions guys throughout the course of the season. You add a Corey Perry, who signs in December, if I'm not mistaken, of 2023, and ultimately plays through. You have the deadline acquisitions, Sam Carrick and Adam Henrique. You have young pieces like Dylan Holloway and Philip Broberg, and to a lesser extent, Ryan McLeod, floating around the periphery, where Ryan McLeod and Dylan Holloway play some games in the regular season, but they really play and really become notable in the postseason. Ditto for Philip Broberg, who, as you'll recall, and it stings me with every passing moment, because Philip Broberg played a certain amount of games, he qualified for restricted free agency. Because he played an X number of regular season games by a certain age, he qualified as a restricted free agent, where if the Oilers, if not Stan Bowman, if Ken Holland had been more prudent in the game usage of players, he could have avoided having the restricted offer sheet situation that arose last summer. And that's where we'll start. Last summer, your two big restricted free agents, Dylan Holloway, Philip Broberg. Holloway and Broberg signed deals that at the time were a bit aggressive. And look, I was very adamant that I thought it was worth matching the offer sheet on Philip Broberg. And we'll get to what I would have done in the next segment, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But purely in the abstract, what allowing those guys to move, and real quick, we should address this. Yes, Ken Holland knew he was not going to extend. He was a lame duck general manager last year. He went through that entire season without negotiating a contract because Jeff Jackson, who was the team president, served as interim GM in that period from the end of June, all of July, and most of August until they hired Stan Bowman at the end of August. Bowman, ultimately the one who got the Draisaitl deal over the finish line. When you talk about it just purely in terms of decision-making, that's why it's so essential and so crucial that you don't have executives, stakeholders in lame duck situations. I always get to, and this is the conspiracy part of my brain, who benefits from what they do. And a lot of it comes down to, for me, is this guy trying to save his job or is he trying to do what's best for the team? Because those are not always the same thing. It is a very clear binary there. Not a lot of things in life are black and white. You can tell when a general manager is making decisions purely based on trying to save their job. The aggressiveness of their maneuvers, how they are maneuvering. Are they burning draft picks on trades? Are they signing guys to contracts they know that on the back end are going to be pretty bad? And Ken Holland put the Oilers in a position where, through poor roster management in terms of games played for some of those guys, and not getting restricted free agent deals done with those guys ahead of time, put the Oilers in a position where they lost two young pieces. And that's really the biggest part of this for me. You losing two young, team-controlled, cheap guys because you did not do your long-term planning. You did not account for X, Y, and Z. You did not put the Oilers in the most favorable position. Now, the other burden of being a consistently good team and a team that makes the Stanley Cup final is generally you're filling out a lot of your roster with short-term solutions, whether those guys you acquire and trade on expiring contracts, 1 or 2 year free agents. It becomes a revolving door. And that's one of the real challenges to maintaining a Stanley Cup contender. How can you build a bottom six that is good enough while accounting for the fact that as a good team, players are going to get bumps in salary because of the success your team generates. So when you lose guys, you have to find ways to fill in gaps. So what did the Oilers do? Well, they signed Adam Henrique, who they had traded for at the deadline last year with Sam Carrick. I thought Adam Henrique had a really nice playoffs 2 years ago in 2024, though I think we all can understand that someone who was shooting almost 20% in the postseason was not going to sustain that. And I think the Oilers, should they have had the opportunity on a mulligan, and I'll give you a hint, I would not have brought Adam Henrique back, especially at the number they ultimately did. Even though $3 million wasn't a lot in the context of the moment, it does feel like it is now. $3 million would have made a real difference this offseason. That would have been room to go and get another goalie. And I'm not saying a starter, but you could have at least upgraded the backup from Calvin Pickard with Adam Henrique's $3 million. But because Henrique took less money to stay with the Oilers, as opposed to where he could have gotten, I believe Tampa Bay was the team that was interested in him, the Oilers had to give him a second year. They gave Corey Perry a modest raise. They gave Connor Brown a modest raise. They gave Matthias Janmark a modest raise. You add up all of those modest raises, that's another $1.5 million. Again, that's not a huge amount of money when we're talking about a 95.5 cap that we're going to be looking at for 2025, 2026. But when you are up against the salary cap ceiling the way the Oilers were last year, you put yourself in an extremely disadvantageous position because you assumed. And granted, recent NHL history had indicated offer sheets were not particularly common. Kotkaniemi, prior to Jesperi Kotkaniemi signing the one with Carolina, it had been an extremely long time since anybody had seriously considered an offer sheet. So I understand why Jeff Jackson didn't particularly feel like it was pressing. It was urgent to get Holloway and Broberg taken care of. But at the same time, I think when you are a team that is in the midst of a window of contention, and you have young, cost-controlled players who are on upward trajectories in a favorable environment, it is incumbent upon you to get those done as soon as possible. You look at the season Dylan Holloway had in St. Louis, 26 goals in not a featured, but a prominent role on a decent Blues team. Blues, of course, were the best team in hockey after the Four Nations face-off, and Jim Montgomery showed up and got those boys locked in, playing world-class defense and timely scoring. But sitting here now, it's easy. And I can acknowledge that, with hindsight, you can say they probably shouldn't have given all these guys multi-year deals. They shouldn't have given guys raises. And look, I can put my hand up. Yeah, I was wrong about Corey Perry's extension last summer. I didn't think it would age well, but he ended up scoring 19 goals, and that worked out pretty well. We are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we'll talk about the moves I would have made and why I think they would have worked out a little bit better. And we will try not to use too much hindsight. Coming up next, right after this break. Have you ever decided last minute to head to a game with your friends or family? Maybe it's game day, and suddenly you just got that itch to be in the stands. That's exactly where Game Time comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merch, or even invite more people to go to the game with you. Game Time makes it happen. Game Time makes buying tickets so fast and easy. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch, and they've got incredible last-minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. Game Time is the official ticketing partner of Locked On MLB, making it so easy to browse the app for upcoming games. I went to Mets Guardians on Tuesday. Didn't go my way, but it was nice to be at the ballpark on a late summer night when the games do matter. My favorite part of the Game Time ticket experience is the panoramic seat view in the app before you buy, so you know exactly what you're walking into when you get to the game. If you're ready to take the guesswork out of buying tickets, you need to download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON NHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are walking through revisionist history. And look, I understand that if you're listening to this episode, you too can make the same determinations that they made the wrong decisions last summer. But this is a thought exercise. This forces me to go to Puckpedia. This forces me to go to Hockey Reference. This forces me to try and find money. This forces me to try and think like a general manager. And that's the benefit of this type of exercise. Now, we know what happened this year. There is no way to materially change what happened. We all know the ifs, ands, or buts. There's only close and horseshoes and hand grenades. I know all the cliches. Believe me, the Monday morning quarterbacking as content, especially from the talking heads who aren't in the weeds doing the work, it becomes nauseating, especially when they do it wrong. It's one thing to say, well, they probably shouldn't have done this because, but if your because is wrong, you just look stupid. You know, the big one last year was, why did the Giants let Saquon Barkley leave? He won a Super Bowl with the Eagles. The Eagles have the best running offense in professional football. Saquon Barkley averaged, I want to say, almost a full yard and a half more before contact year over year, going from the Giants to the Eagles, because the Eagles are optimized for an elite running back. Their quarterback is extremely mobile. He is a threat. Jalen Hurts in the running game. Same thing with Derrick Henry going from the Titans to the Ravens. You saw almost a full yard and a half more per carry from Derrick Henry year over year because of the threat of Lamar Jackson in the running game. That doesn't mean Derrick Henry wasn't good the year before on the on the Titans. It doesn't mean Saquon Barkley wasn't good as a football player on the Giants. Production is not commensurate with talent. Now, the more talent you have, the easier it is to produce more consistently. No one's disputing that. But we are capable of context. We are capable of understanding environmental factors. And that's one of the keys to this exercise in particular. Now, Dylan Holloway, should the Oilers have kept him, and I do think if the Oilers had just had the foresight to extend him and Broberg throughout the course of the season, when they both had yet to really get going, which I do think is another important point of contention here when we're talking about Broberg and Dylan Holloway, because just straight up, when you think about it, it's kind of crazy that the Oilers let two guys this young leave the way they did. And I get why Ken Holland was doing what he was doing. But prior to going to St. Louis this past year, Philip Broberg had 81 career NHL regular season games as an Oiler. 81 in 3 years. This is a former first-round pick, 8th overall back in 2019. He played almost as many games in a single season as a member of the Blues as he did in the 3 prior seasons combined. You do the same exercise for Dylan Holloway, who was a first-round pick in 2020, 2021, something like that. And prior to going to the Blues, Dylan Holloway had 89 regular season games under his belt, and he had scored 9 regular season goals in 2 seasons. I am capable of understanding that if the Oilers kept Dylan Holloway this past season, if he was on the team this year for 2024, 2025, he's probably not scoring 26 goals. And that's part of the challenge of this exercise because, well, if they keep Dylan Holloway, What does that do to the lineup instead? So we can safely assume, and in my exercise, the Oilers do not, even though I liked what, again, hindsight, I liked what the Oilers got from Jeff Skinner. But for what the Oilers paid Jeff Skinner, they would have been better off giving Dylan Holloway $4.5 million per year and having a player ascending, having team control of a player in their mid-20s who has the capacity to get better. And look, I think Jeff Skinner was a reasonable bounce-back candidate. Someone who has shown 30 goal scoring capacity in the past, somebody who has played with elite players in the past, somebody who needs a good year to bet on themselves to try and get another big contract in his early 30s. All of the factors were there for Jeff Skinner to put up good numbers and to have a bounce-back season coming off of being bought out by the Buffalo Sabres. Of course, Jeff Skinner failed to earn the trust of Chris Knoblauch. His defensive and forechecking, his defensive game and his forechecking never really got to a place that Chris Knoblauch was particularly comfortable with deploying him in the top six, even though on a per 60-minute basis, Skinner put together really good numbers. So we are going to keep Dylan Holloway instead of signing Jeff Skinner. Of course, that means we would have needed to have signed Dylan Holloway before it got to an offer sheet, which means that we would have taken care of that at the end of the season. I would have made it more of a priority to sign Dylan Holloway, to sign Philip Broberg, than I would have signing Skinner or Arvidsson or giving Corey Perry and Adam Henrique and Matthias Janmark and Connor Brown raises. I think you are infinitely more likely to be successful if you are gambling on upside. And look, I get it. The Oilers are a team that is in their window of contention right now. They feel they cannot afford to take risks on young players because young players have too much variance. They could be up here, they could be here, they could be there. If you're trying to win the Stanley Cup, here isn't here or here, but this is better than that. And that's the way the Oilers operated last summer. Now, the trickle-down effect of that. So let's say they do. They keep Broberg, they keep Holloway. They almost certainly cannot afford to keep Adam Henrique at $3 million. I think that works out better. I do think locking Ryan Nugent-Hopkins in as the third line center ultimately leads to a slightly worse defensive bottom six because Nuge at this point in his career, I don't think can really be a matchup center. I think he's infinitely better situated skill set wise to be the first line left wing. But I think in terms of practicality and functionality, I think you have a better chance of Ryan Nugent-Hopkins being a better third-line center than Adam Henrique is. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is a better hockey player. He has more offensive upside. He's a strong penalty killer. He's played the most penalty-killing minutes of any Oiler since being drafted. I mean, this is a really strong defensive hockey player, and I think in a more specialized defensive role, he would have taken to that a little bit better than maybe the defensive responsibilities associated with playing on a first line. Now, what does that do? So, if you sign Holloway, where's he playing? To me, I think he's playing on the first line with Connor McDavid. I think Evander Kane probably doesn't have to LTIR shenanigans the entire season. I know the NHL had at one point said they were looking into that, but I do think the Oilers probably would have managed Evander Kane's summer a little differently last summer if there was a clear landing spot for Holloway and him to play. But, of course, that's what they are. And the last part of this, and the other part that I think positive, even though ultimately long-term maybe not, if you sign Philip Broberg last summer instead of Skinner, Arvidsson, and the old guy raises, you don't trade for Jake Wallman at the trade deadline this year. So that's really your trade-off. Would you rather have Dylan Holloway and Philip Broberg, or would you rather have Jake Wallman? Would you rather have Dylan Holloway and Philip Broberg or Jake Wallman, Ike Howard, Matthew Savoie? Because those are really the trade-offs here. Maybe the Oilers don't go out and trade for Vasily Podkolzin because they don't need to dump salary. These are real questions to consider. They maybe don't even dump Cody Ceci to the Sharks for Ty Emberson and a draft pick because they don't know. That's the fun of these exercises. It forces you to think and then consider the contingencies. We are going to take our second and final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, I'm going to break it all down, what it means, and then, real quick, we'll talk about this summer coming up next. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on today's Friday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we're doing a good old dose of revisionist history. And I do these a lot as a thought exercise because not only does it make me think about how I like to think about hockey, it forces me to try and understand other people's thought process, philosophies, and opinions. That is the value in meticulously studying transactions, roster construction, drafting, because those tell you, those are tidbits. When a team signs a Jeff Skinner, that tells you we need goal scoring. We need offense. We need skating. If they sign a Corey Perry, we need experience. We need leadership. We think if we put him in the right spot, he still might have a little bit of juice to squeeze. These are the types of thought processes. You think about it, what I just said about Broberg and Holloway last segment. If you choose to sign Arvidsson and Jeff Skinner over your young ascending guys, that's telling everybody we don't have the patience to wait for these guys to continue their ascension. Dylan Holloway very much could be a 30-goal guy if he was playing with Leon Draisaitl or Connor McDavid. That might be a year or two from now, a full season later too, but you wouldn't have had to go out and trade for Ike Howard. You wouldn't have had to trade up at the end of the draft last year for Logan O'Reilly. These are the questions and the contingencies that come to mind when you start to grapple with the realities of missed opportunities. And that's what this past season was. And we did a really deep conversation on Wednesday about the nature of evaluating a season that doesn't end in a championship when you're in a championship window, because I think we get a little bit too lost in the binary of good season, bad season, success, failure, legend, or flop. It really reaches a tipping point. So you have to account. You want to learn. That, for me, is the tool here. That is what makes these exercises valuable, is not only are we saying, well, they did this, this, and this because they thought X, Y, and Z. Well, why didn't it work? Well, Jeff Skinner didn't earn Chris Knobloch's trust. Victor Arvidsson didn't find a stylistic fit for what the Oilers wanted him for and his skill set. I think when you talk about Jake Wallman, that's an example of something working. I think Jake Wallman has real upside potential. That is somebody who could sign a long-term extension to be an Oiler into the foreseeable future and could potentially be the long-term Matthias Ekholm replacement. If the Oilers viewed Dylan Holloway as potentially the long-term Zach Hyman replacement, I think there would have been a very different conversation about what his trajectory was and how aggressively they needed to keep him. And look, I do think the simple matter of the fact is having such vastly different organizational philosophies from one GM to the other, when you let Ken Holland go through last year as the lame duck without preemptively announcing a successor, you put him in a position where he felt he could go for broke and it would be the next guy's problem. And sometimes it's like that as a general manager. And I always go back to the one scene in Moneyball where Art Howe tells Billy Beane, I got to make decisions that I can explain in interviews next year. And if you're, Ken Holland, who got the Kings job this past summer, and he sat down for interviews with a bunch of teams, the Islanders, the Kings, who he ended up hiring with, I believe. I want to say he interviewed for Seattle as well, but I could be wrong about that. He needed to be able to explain why he did the things he did. And sometimes I think you get better situations than others. I think certain teams, you think about LA, Rob Blake, former player, not that far removed. I know Rob Blake's kind of old now even for me, Rob Blake's kind of old, but that's a guy who's in the boys club. That's somebody who's going to look at Ken Holland and say, Ken gets it. He was in Detroit. They won all those championships. This is a guy who understands leadership. This is a guy who understands how to marshal teams over the finish line. And I think you get away with saying things, well, we needed to focus on our floor. We were not in a position where we could wait for Dylan Holloway or Philip Broberg to figure it out. I would much rather have been in a position where, yeah, we could have used those guys in their subsequent production, but ultimately, I think we were better off focusing on trying to raise our floor as high as possible and hoping that our star players, Connor, Leon, Evan Bouchard, could get us over that finish line. And that's really the trick here. That is really the trick when you want to understand how certain GMs do things. And look, some GMs are better at playing for upside versus playing for high floor. And I am always going to be of the opinion, and you guys, if you're an everydayer, you've heard me say it, I'd always rather play for the high ceiling. And yes, that's me who's not a stakeholder. I'm not getting paid, seven figures. I don't have a wife. I don't have a family. I'm not the one who's in charge of an NHL franchise. But the way I look at it is if I ever, for some godforsaken reason, I know I'm probably not getting another chance at this. And I would rather do everything in my power to try and get my team as close as they could so that I would be less reliant on a handful of guys. I would try and find ways to sustain windows of contention longer and pick and choose when to be aggressive versus when to play for floor. And I don't know. Would you rather have Dylan Holloway or would you rather have Jake Wallman? Because those are the types of questions I'm thinking about right now. In the dead of summer, 2 months removed from losing in the Cup final, a second straight season, I'm thinking about what went wrong in each of the last two finals. I'm thinking about how the Oilers are probably more likely than not plateaued. They've lost a lot of talent over the last 2 years. You think about losing a Philip Broberg, a Dylan Holloway, Warren Fogle. Even though they didn't work out well, Skinner and Arvidsson, that's another 30 goals right there. Trading Evander Kane, who's a pretty consistent 20-25 goal guy. You think about needing to replace that with Podkolzin, with Ike Howard, with Matthew Savoie, banking on Zach Hyman and Ryan Nugent-Hopkins and Adam Henrique bouncing back in their early to mid 30s. Those are all more challenging now. And that's the last point I want to leave you with before we wrap up for the weekend. As a general manager, the longer you wait to face the music, the longer you avoid friction, difficult choices, the more drastic the eventual action is going to need to be. The most perfect example are the Penguins. The Penguins kept trying and trying and trying. And because they were so aggressive under Ron Hextall, because of the poor decisions they made that were so short-sighted, they put themselves in a position where they now have to tear it down all the way. I figure the Islanders likely are going to need to do that for a year or two to start over, to get where they want to go. Because the longer you wait, the longer things build up, the more there is to get rid of, the harder it is to get liquid again. It is so difficult to make cap space once you are locked into contracts. You give out no trades, no movements. The job becomes impossible. And that's the thing, man. The Oilers, more likely than not, miss their best shot in this specific window. Now, real quick, if Ekholm is healthy, Zach Hyman's a 35-goal guy, if Ike Howard hits 20, okay. You'll be in the mix at the deadline. Maybe you go trade for Brian Rust. Maybe you go trade for Ricard Raquel. Maybe you trade for Artemi Panarin. There are so many possibilities between now and then. But you got to know your history. You got to account. You got to learn. And most importantly, you got to think. It's a real challenge with all of the distractions, with all of the noise, all of the nonsense. Go into the sheets. Learn the players. Get an idea. And start to formulate your own. It's not just what I think. What do you think? That's what matters. I'm trying to lay out as much philosophical and ideology as I can because this is the way I think. And if you understand the way I'm explaining things, even if you don't agree with my opinions, there are people who are going to comment this video, why would we have kept Broberg and Holloway? They were overpaid. Okay, that's your opinion. Tell me why. And that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Thank you to everyone who made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network where we've got your team covered every day. Subscribe over on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, leave the show a 5-star review. The reviews help the show so much more than you think. Check out Locked On NHL and Locked On NHL Game Night, where they are previewing all 32 teams ahead of the 2025-2026 NHL season. Everyone have a safe and fun weekend. I will talk to you guys on Monday. Until then, let's go Oilers.